that recording is in progress. So hello, recording. I actually think that the fact that there are so many Jewish names that are sometimes difficult to say, especially with some particular sounds that not everyone says well, I'm thinking the ch sound in particular, is actually a very good segue to start with one of the basic cultural competency skills when talking to Orthodox people, especially Orthodox rabbis, about LGBTQ issues. Because most rabbis and most Orthodox rabbis are used to people struggling or mispronouncing their names. And that is a kind of ubiquitous experience for many Orthodox Jews to understand that when someone says that my name is Hanania Klein-Kaufman, which perhaps is not necessarily a name that rolls off the tongue if you're not really familiar with this community, that someone may either, with the best of intentions, struggle a little with the pronunciation, maybe pronounce it wrong or pronounce it a little differently, or just kind of change a few things. And so that's really part of the experience almost of being of Orthodox and having a biblical name with Jewish guttural sounds. And the reason why I think that it's a great segue into some LGBTQ cultural competency is because so much of especially when dealing with youth, of the narrative right now is the way that youth want to be seen, the way that youth want to be called, the names that youth want to be referred to, and of course the pronouns that young people and queer people in general, but particularly young people in this talk, want other people to use when referring to them. And there's so, unfortunately, I think, that pronouns have been co-opted by political forces and other, and sometimes even academic papers, when perhaps the easiest way to explain the importance and the sensitivity of pronouns, even to a very right-wing rabbi, is the way that a Jewish name sometimes sounds when you introduce yourself. And like, if a Rabbi Hanania Klein-Kaufman, I'm sure that when you introduce yourself and they ask you your name, perhaps in many times, the person that's receiving your name has not heard that before and may struggle and may make mistakes. But that doesn't mean that they get to call you Bob, because that would be really rude, right? Right? So if, in terms, if it explained in that, you kind of decatastrophize right away and like make a connection between the way that perhaps queer people want to be seen and the way you may want to be seen yourself. Someone may refer to themselves with a pronoun that you are not familiar with, much like a name that you might have that a lot of other people are not familiar with. You may not even know how to use it, how to pronounce it. You may make mistakes. You may even get nervous because you have the best of intentions, but you're like, oh no, I'm going to screw up. And that actually may even bother you because we do want to do better and we don't like screwing up. But that doesn't give you the same way that it wouldn't give someone else the right to just dismiss your name, Hanania Klein-Kaufman, and then call you something that's easier for them. That would be so rude and kind of anti-Semitic, right? Like if someone's like, hi, my name is Hanania Klein-Kaufman. Oh, that's wonderful, but I'm going to call you Bob. Like how would that make you feel if that happens? Instead, let someone at least try to engage with the name Hanania. Let someone try to say it and make a mistake, or let someone ask you, do you have a nickname? Or do you have something else I can call you, right? At least that can engage conversation. So right away, just with kind of introducing names of Orthodox names and Jewish names and understanding that in terms of kind of queer names and the way we, and particularly youth, want to be seen, there are immediately like low-hanging fruits, intersections that perhaps can engender empathy, and that can create empathy, that can promote empathy. And I think that So I immediately, when talking during introductions, and especially during introductions when it's an LGBTQ conversation with very Orthodox or Hasidic rabbis, start with the names right away. Because it seems like right away it's something, oh, you have difficult names, and sometimes queer people have names or ways that they want to be referred that are difficult to you, and that's okay. And we can be, and that's kind of the messiness of life, that I may not be used to the way you call yourself, and you may not be used to the way queer people call themselves, and that's all right. And just because we're not used to it doesn't mean that anybody needs to be angry, that anybody needs to have a certain political opinion about this, or anybody. It's literally the most banal thing in the world. I'm struggling with something that I haven't pronounced before. So it's like, I like to start that way, to kind of decatastrophize what some people like, I think immediately creates fault lines in the sand, and which doesn't have to, when kind of, explained in a type of kind of, this is really just about names, the difficulty pronouncing names, and and names that I haven't heard yet. But okay, so that's just a little Vorspeise, a little appetizer of where we're gonna go. But I'm gonna now start in the beginning. My name is Mordechai. Mordechai Levovitz. Again, not the easiest name to say, not the worst name to say. It's interesting that Mordechai is actually a very popular name among Jews and among Orthodox Jews. For anybody who knows the Purim story, Mordechai is one of the heroes of the Purim story. That was the most recent Jewish holiday that we just celebrated. But in fact, Mordechai is not Hebrew, and Mordechai is not a Jewish name. Mordechai is actually a Persian name. Mordechai is Marduk. That is not a name that is sourced or originally within the Jewish people. Marduk was a popular Persian name, in fact, the name of a Persian deity at the time, and there was a lot of cultural mixing. In fact, at the time, the Persians during the Persian reign were actually kinder to the Jews than some of the other large empires of the time. Now, it's a pretty low bar, but they were kinder, and there was you do see a lot of Persian names kind of coming into the Jewish fold, and Mordechai, so it's actually not a Jewish word and not a Hebrew word, it's a Persian word, and that we just kind of keep going. But which is also an interesting part of kind of Judaism and Jewish culture, and particularly Orthodox Judaism, that that some of the things that we are most known for are actually things that we have that have cultural significance for us, but aren't necessarily cultural sourced within our community. Like, for example, when we see Hasidim often, we think of people with big black fur hats, right? And that's, we think, big black fur hats, and it's called a strimal. And we think, oh, when I see a big black fur hat, especially, in that kind of round way, I'm thinking, oh, this is a Hasidic Jew. When in fact, the big black fur hat was a style choice when a certain community of Jews lived within Eastern Europe. That was the style of kind of professional wear, big black fur hats for the Eastern European winters. And there was a cultural significance to the time, because there was a moment within Judaism where that was a kind of a special moment for Hasidic Judaism. There were really great rabbis, there were great transformations within the community, great things were written. This is during the Pale of Settlement period, so we're talking about 1700s, 1800s, and so it's so that that style has cultural significance, but not necessarily culturally born within Judaism. So there's a rich history within Orthodox Judaism and even the most right-wing Hasidic Judaism of cultural influencing, both being influenced and influencing. I wouldn't, sometimes I think people often think of Hasidic Judaism or very right-wing Judaism as a ascetic, not aesthetic, but an ascetic religion, almost like the Amish, in which they completely retreat from society. But that's actually not the history of these traditions. These traditions certainly perhaps today have retreated from certain modern society, for example, maybe social media or other things. There are not a lot of Hasidic rabbis on Instagram, for example. You're not there. There are probably one or two, they're not a lot. but when thinking about the history of Hasidism, which is not that long, it's just a few hundred years, it was born out of a cultural influence of the time. And in a time that this kind of influence was particularly culturally significant. So it is interesting to think about right-wing or ultra-religious or ultra-Orthodox Judaism as not necessarily a completely culture apart, but just a culture that had its particular cultural identity significance at a certain moment in time, which again, not that long ago, just a few hundred years ago. And the same thing can be said about Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews, that their culture, their kind of cultural identity moment, where a lot of the traditions come from, actually are far predate Hasidic Judaism. That go back all the way to the very, very old Jewish communities in Arab lands, in African lands, and in the southern Spain area, where you had a mixing of African, Arab, and European cultures, also in around the 1400s. So it's a bit older, but also really the cultural identity is based on this time where there was a cultural influence, there was a cultural kind of osmosis going on. And so Orthodoxy is often, the different types of Orthodox Judaism is often identified with moments of cultural osmosis, not necessarily moments of cultural apartness. It just today we see apartness because these moments of cultural identity were very specific moments in the past, but not that long ago. Judaism of 5,000 years ago looked very, very different, and probably would be somewhat unrecognizable to Orthodoxy today, because of course 5,000 years ago would be before the Persians, before the Arabs, and before the Christian Europeans. So we do kind of there is a history of interaction with culture, and which is, I think, why the talking and engaging with Orthodox Judaism on issues of gender and sexuality can be difficult, because, and we'll talk about those difficulties, but also there are lots of opportunities, because again, Judaism does have this history of engaging with culture, with the outside culture, and with the culture that it is influenced by. So it is not unheard of. So before I go on, let's just get like some generally understood vocabulary out there. Does everyone, when I say Orthodox Jew, do people know what I'm talking about, or like the Orthodox Jewish community? You could just raise your hand or speak out loud if you'd like, just because I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what community that we're talking about here. So what do I mean what do you think when I say, when you hear Orthodox Jew or Orthodox Jewish person? Anybody? I'm not scary. I promise you're allowed to say wrong answers.
I think for me, when I used to live in Los Angeles, depending on where in LA, I would see a lot of Orthodox Jew, and so yeah, and they were usually stayed in their own neighborhood. Yeah.
And how did you recognize them as, how did you recognize in your mind, oh, this is an Orthodox Jew and this is perhaps not an Orthodox Jew?
I would think by their garment, the hat and the coats, things like that.
So what you're talking about predominantly are Hasidic Jews.
Yeah.
So because the Hasidic Jews are that moment around perhaps 300-400 years ago in Europe, where that was that cultural significant moment, a cultural identity moment. So they're going to keep that dress of what Europeans dressed like in Eastern Europe during during that time, and so that's Hasidic Judaism. Not the oldest segment of Orthodox Judaism. In fact, one of the newer forms of Orthodox Judaism. Hasidic Judaism was very influenced by two things. One, the idea that the person, the worker, the person who was working the field, the pauper, the person that perhaps was not literate, also had access to a complete Jewish spiritual experience. Right? You didn't have to be a yeshiva student, someone who knows how to read and write and have gone to school and has money and has privilege. Someone who literally is just a peddler can access the full Jewish spiritual, almost mystical experience. So it was more of a like a spiritual socialist movement, in the idea that that even people that were not of privilege, whether that privilege is of from money or from education, or even from a quote unquote good family, can have religious ecstasy. And that was kind of this kind of revolution within Judaism called Hasidism. It kind of re-understood Judaism, not necessarily through the idea that you had to study and go to yeshiva and learn Hebrew and learn Aramaic and learn all the Bible and become, and become that's good, but not necessary, right? There's another way. And this other way is that even if you are just a peddler, or even if you just work on a field, or even if you are part of this community where there is a religious leader, a Rebbe, a kind of spiritual conduit to God, right? All you need to really do is be part of this community and honor the Rebbe and pray and have the Rebbe pray for you, pray with you, and create a social structure that upholds the Rebbe, and you too can have access to the full Jewish mystical and emotional experience. It was very revolutionary at its time, and it was very controversial at its time. A lot of the more right-wing rabbis did not agree with this and said, no, that Judaism is about law and about education and about understanding Hebrew and understanding the Bible. Right? They were not okay with this, but it was a populist movement, and it really kind of took hold, especially among the poorer communities within Eastern Europe. And that's really and now it is probably the fastest growing facet of Orthodox Judaism. because of its populist nature, of the idea that everyone can really have access to this kind of ecstatic spiritual experience. And then we see that with the Hasidic Jews, like you said, sometimes wear long black coats. Many of the men have long payas, which is sideburns, sometimes curly sideburns. And many of the men will wear fur hats, sometimes fur black hats, and the women, when they're married, usually shave their head and wear a wig, or have very, very, very short hair, and then wear a wig, or wear just a head covering. It could be it doesn't have to be, it could be a hat, it could be a wrap. And that is kind of Hasidic Judaism. Hasidic Judaism is also a mystical form of Judaism, whereas the more traditional Judaism before Hasidism, and that also exists now, is more rooted in education and law. Hasidism really kind of raises the kind of mystical experience, the spirit life, the spirit world. And it was influenced by a very kind of a mystical movement within Christianity that happened maybe 100 years before the Hasidic movement kind of adopted it. So that's the Hasidic movement. And like I said, the interesting thing about the Hasidic movement that's relevant to us is that the Hasidic movement tends to be more right-wing when it comes to when we think of the small c conservative versus progressive ideologies, but also in particular, most Hasidic families do not use birth control, very similar to some Catholic families. So you have very large families. It is not unheard of at all for Hasidic families to have 10, 11, 12 children. So within the Hasidic community, you have families of these very, very large families, and they're actually, when you look at the population of Hasidic communities, they're youth heavy, because there are so many more children than there were adults. Some people also like to, some sociologists kind of connect this to the impulse to rebuild the Hasidic community after the Holocaust, because the Hasidic community obviously was very much wiped out in Europe from the Holocaust. And that could be true, but if you would ask most Hasidic people, they would say, well, it's the law. You can't, you can't have birth control. It's and therefore, and it is a sex positive culture, which means that there is no sin, there is no such thing as original sin in general within Judaism, but also particularly within Hasidic Judaism. So it is a very, very big mitzvah. Mitzvah is a kind of good commandment or moral goodness to have sex with your wife, or for a wife to have sex with her husband. So there is a big promotion. You're a husband and wife are supposed to have as much sex as possible. Now, within a certain amount of laws, right, there also are menstruation laws, which a woman cannot have sex while she's on her period. So she's only having as much sex as possible for 2 weeks out of the month. But during those 2 weeks, there is this idea is that that husband and wife should be having sex. And also, interestingly, that does not stop after menopause. The husband and wife are expected to still have sex. Sex is not, there's no real connection between the importance of having sex and the importance of having babies. Sex is a value in and of itself within Judaism, and particularly within Orthodox Judaism. So the Rebbe wants, the Rebbe, which is a spiritual leader, wants couples to be engaged in regular sex. If they're not having sex once a day, that would be an issue. It could be even grounds for divorce. a woman is allowed to demand sex from her husband, which is an interesting thing. So yeah, and this is true in general for Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism tends to be a sex positive religion, in terms of that sex is considered not only a moral goodness, but a commandment. And does not necessarily have to be connected to procreation. Procreation has its own laws. Procreation is also a good thing, and in fact, like I said, for most Hasidic Jews, there's a law against birth control, which then creates large families. So let's bring it back to LGBTQ issues. Well, now in this kind of world where there are far more children than there are parents, if there are only 2 parents and there are 11 children, so we can assume that just with some of our basic statistics of understanding human sexuality and gender within how many queer people, LGBTQIA people are in basic human society, and then we have different numbers, obviously, and we can talk. That's a whole other talk about how many, the percentage of queer people within humanity, but certainly anywhere between 3 and 20% of people are going to be LGBTQ plus IA, and so if you're going to have 11 children, the chances are that in every family of 11 children, there will likely be one person who is LGBTQ. So just to think about that, right? So in nearly every Hasidic family that has 10 children, which is many, if not most Hasidic families, there's probably a queer child in every one of those families. So just kind of like to think of LGBTQ people within this society, you're talking about in every single household. Statistically, at least, we're thinking. So that is the fastest growing segment of the Orthodox community, Hasidic Jews. They're also the easiest to identify from the outside because, like you said, Vida, is that your name? Vida. So Vida, like Vida said, it's the dress is particular. There's a particular dress, so it's easy to kind of the next subset of Orthodoxy is what we like to think of as either Hasidic, not Hasidic, but Haredi, which is another cha word, which is sometimes people don't. We sometimes call it ultra Orthodox, although today ultra Orthodox is a bit of a problematic term because a lot of ultra Orthodox people don't like the word ultra Orthodox, so and they prefer the word Haredi. But Haredi hasn't really taken hold yet, so we're in a very interesting kind of time in terms of how we respond. But Haredi, or what's often known as Yeshivish Judaism. I think of yes. I'm sorry, I wasn't looking at the chat. Now I am looking at the chat. So if you wanted to read the chat now I'm reading it. So Haredi Judaism, Yeshivish Judaism, or just when we think ultra Orthodox Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism is another one. These are Jews who are dedicated to halacha. Halacha or halacha is Jewish law. And that's when the dedication before anything else is to Jewish law, the laws of the Bible and the laws of the Talmud. Now, this predates Hasidic Judaism. The idea is that these laws have divine come from some divine inspiration. So there is an immutability to them, or it's very, very hard for them to change. And there is a dedication to them, and the laws that, if you actually read the Old Testament, there are a few stories in the first in Genesis, but most of the Old Testament is really just laws. Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do this. Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do this. If this person does that, then you do that. And then this, it's just lots and lots of laws. And the Talmud, which is the kind of oral tradition that happened in Rabbinic Judaism after, is very kind of law-based. It's almost like it's very similar to law books that you would study in law school, or in other ways, it's also kind of similar to kind of medical school books about, like, it's very objective, kind of, if this happens, then this happens. If you see this, then you do this. Everything, it's about kind of what can be observed, what kind of criteria we can create to then apply a law that is rooted, whether in rabbinic law or biblical law. I'm going to read the question that Santana just read. How is non-hetero and non-cisgender sex viewed among different Jewish communities, and what are varying beliefs? I'm going to get to that really soon. So let's put that away for a second, and we're going to work up to that. So Orthodox Judaism and a Haredi Judaism or Yeshivish Judaism is this dedication to law. Sometimes this belief that the law itself cannot, or it's very difficult to change, because the law has its root in divine origin. So the most recognizable way to see and to think about who is an Orthodox Jew there is if it usually, and again, this is not, there are exceptions, but usually a man or someone who identifies as a man would wear a yarmulke, like a little yarmulke, something over their head, this kind of little beanie thing. It doesn't have to be any size. It could be tiny, it could be big, it could be, right? It's a law-based idea to wear a yarmulke. And many, not all, but many Orthodox Jewish women do cover their hair in some way after they're married. Now, that doesn't mean that they all wear full wigs, right? Much like the yarmulke can be small or could be large. So it could be that they cover their hair with a fall, which is just kind of extensions, or they cover their hair with a hat, or they cover their hair sometimes when they go to synagogue and not other times. But it is rooted in law, right? This is not necessarily a tradition or a spiritual practice. There is a law that must be followed. And of course, one of the most common things that we all know about is kosher, is the way they eat, right? The way that Orthodox Jews will follow the laws of kosher. And kosher laws are the laws that are what one can eat, what one can't eat, that is stated in the Bible.
Mordechai,
yes.
Vanessa has her hand up.
Oh, absolutely, Vanessa. I'm sorry, I didn't see the hand. But and Carolyn, do you mind also helping me that way? Because I'm not really able to look at hands, so that would be very helpful. Thank
Absolutely.
you. Vanessa, yes.
Thank you, Mordechai. I just wanted to ask a quick clarifying question. I'm a beginner and learning about Judaism. And from what I've heard you say, there's Orthodox Jew, but there's also facets of Orthodox. So I just want to make sure I'm following that you spoke about the different facets, which is a Hasidic or Haredi. But I'm curious of what is it that links them all as calling them Orthodox?
Totally.
Just for my understanding as we move forward.
No, it's a really good question, and it's a controversial question because within Orthodox Judaism there is kind of our own identity politics on who is and who is not Orthodox. So I wish I can give you a kind of an agreed upon question. Usually, so from the outside, it's usually understood that Hasidic Jews, Sephardi Mizrahi Jews, traditional Sephardi Mizrahi Jews, and and halachic Jews, Jews who, like I'm explaining right now, who believe that the law is divine and the law must be followed or must be engaged with, are all under the category of Orthodox Jews. So now there are internal discussions about whether there is more objective criteria. So some people like to say, well, if you violate the Sabbath and you don't eat and you don't follow kosher, right? Those are two like of the main criteria. People who work on the Sabbath and people who don't follow kosher laws are not considered Orthodox Jews. But if you keep the Sabbath and if you follow kosher rules, then you would be then it's more likely that you'd be within the Orthodox kind of identity or milieu. That's a very kind of crude criteria that some people some people use as a quick, it's a way that you don't have to get philosophical about it. You're like, well, do you keep kosher? Or do you follow this? Do you follow Sabbath laws? And if you do, then you would be considered Orthodox. And if you don't, then perhaps you would not be considered Orthodox. I think it's more. I like to think of it as more of a community identity that doesn't necessarily have objective criteria. If you grew up in the Orthodox community, in a community that uses the word Orthodox, and whether or not you follow the Sabbath or keep kosher, but if you feel that you are part of that community, well, then I think you have a right to kind of use that word, and right, because that's a community that you identify with. And it's a community that you grew up in. It's a community that you're so influenced with and has become part of your identity. So I wish I can give you better answers. I think those are three answers that I gave you. One, the answer of people who believe that the laws of the Bible and the laws of the rabbis have a divine origin and must be taken seriously and engaged with and followed. Or that's one. Two, the criterias of eating kosher and keeping the Sabbath. And three, the idea is that if you grew up in a community that used the word Orthodox, there's a certain identifying nature that you also kind of use this word community because you feel part of that. It's a communal identity, almost a collective identity experience. So those are the three kind of different ways to figure out who is Orthodox and who is not. But I also promise you that for every 2 Jews, there are 5 opinions. So take that with lots of grains of salt, but not too much salt because Jews don't like things too spicy. But I hope that I want to come to LGBTQ people. So I'm going to just quickly go over the Sephardi Mizrahi community. So the Sephardi Mizrahi community are Jews whose kind of cultural identity was born when they created Jewish communities when they were living in either the Middle East or Africa or southern Spain, which at the time had a large Arab influence. These are Jews that really that was very much part of the Arabic and the Muslim Renaissance during a time where perhaps the Christian community and the European community were not as friendly to Jews as the Muslim community and the Arab community were. There's a lot of influence and intersections with Arabic and Muslim philosophers. One of the greatest kind of Sephardi Mizrahi Jewish thinkers is known as Rambam or Rav Moshe ben Maimon, Maimonides. People call him Maimonides sometimes, and Maimonides was both a doctor, a philosopher, and wrote in Arabic. extremely influenced by the Muslim Renaissance, which itself was actually influenced by Greek philosophy, which is an interesting thing, and a really a huge expanse in mathematical thinking and scientific thinking. And this is Sephardi Mizrahi Judaism, which is very interesting and I think essential part of when we think of the Orthodox Jewish experience. Many, if not all, Sephardi Mizrahi Jews think of themselves as people of color because most of them do come from either Africa or Asia. And there is a lot of, in terms of, and I this is kind of a little controversial thing that I guess I have to say, but if you notice, Jews from Europe tend to look European, and Jews from Africa tend to look a little more African, like Ethiopian Jews look pretty Ethiopian to me, and Jews from Yemen look like they come from Yemen. I think that's because Jews, wherever they were one, there were lots of converts wherever we were. Jews weren't so separate from the society that we would live in, and also there was lots of intermarriage. And there perhaps could have been lots of rape also. So I think that even kind of looking at the kind of genetic story of Jews, it's not only that we were influenced traditionally. I think that there was also a lot of mixing of peoples, and that's why Jews kind of look a little like the countries that we that we come from. But that's another side thing. But it's good. It's great. I mean, it's nice because there is really a diversity of the Jewish people, which I think lends itself and makes our community so beautiful, like diversity tends to do. So that is the interesting thing about the Sephardic Mizrahi community is that when people, it's less focused on law, less necessarily focused on the Eastern European and European mystical traditions, and more focused on what we think of as communal traditions, the way my father did it, the way his father did it, and the way his father's father did it, the way my mother did something, the way her mother did something, and her mother's mother, right? It was very rooted in a kind of ancestral, it has value because this is the way my ancestors did it. And this is unique. It's not, it's different than, it's not because it's the law, and it's not because I have access to a mystical, like some sort of exaltation or ecstasy experience, which is more Hasidic Judaism. It is very rooted in ancestral tradition, which, by the way, is not surprising when you think of African and Arabic traditions. Also, you have traditions very rooted in ancestral traditions. The idea that this has value because my parents did it, and my grandparents did it, and my great-great-grandparents did it. And the reason why I'm making these three distinctions about the part of Orthodox Judaism that is very law-focused, part of Judaism, Orthodox Judaism that is very spiritual-focused, and part of Orthodox Judaism that is very ancestral-focused, is because these three kind of narratives affect the way these communities see gender and sexuality, and particularly the way that they respond to LGBTQ youth in their community, because they are using the values of their own identity to kind of understand these experiences. So I'm going to get back to that soon, but I'm going to talk about just, first of all, let's talk about queer youth from these communities. So before I started a little talking about numbers, and obviously the greatest numbers are of youth in the whole Jewish world. The greatest number of youth is found in the Hasidic community, because you have families of 10, 11, 12. In general, Orthodox families, I think your average right now is 3 children, around 3 children, and in Sephardi Mizrahi families also around 3 to 5 children. But so the Hasidic family is a lot more children, a lot more youth, a lot quicker growing populations, and where you will see the most young people, you will obviously see the most LGBTQ youth, because I mean, there's no reason to think that for some strange reason there are more queer people in one community than the other. Perhaps there are different ways and languages of talking about it, but the human sexual and gender experience is pretty much common among all cultures and among all people. What I mean by that is that you will see in nearly every culture in the world that there will be some people who will have sexual attraction to people of their own gender. There will, in almost all cultures of the world, there will be people who have obviously sexual attraction to people of opposite gender. You will see in all cultures of the world people who have sexual attraction to neither gender or don't have sexual attraction. So these things are seen in all cultures. They have different words for it in different cultures, and I think and many times it's the words that make the biggest of differences. In Hasidic culture, when I said before, it's very rooted in a spiritual experience. And it's a spiritual experience that everyone can have access to: women, men, poor people, rich people, educated people, and not educated people. They see the role of the roles in their community as part of the spiritual experience, right? It's not necessarily how much you know, but your role in the community, that it gives you access to mystical exaltation. So within the Hasidic community, they are more likely to view gender in terms of a gender essentialist model, that there is a spiritual experience called womanhood. There is a spiritual experience called malehood, whatever that is. The role of a man, the role of a woman is understood as this spiritual kind of existence and role, and therefore, and that's how they're going to kind of see, and it's given to you by God, right? Given to you by God, which is interesting, because when we're seeing LGBTQ teens from these communities, often the presentation is in a more gender essentialist queer narrative. What I mean by that is that you have the narrative a lot within these communities of let's say someone is assigned female at birth and now is identifying as male. So he would come from a Hasidic community. A more likely narrative is my spirit is really male. Yes, my body is female, but my spirit is really male, right? I have the spiritual experience of a male, even though my body is, even though I was assigned female at birth. And there's a spiritual or essentialist conflict between the body and the spirit. And the same thing can be said through most LGBTQ experiences, even sexuality, which is also a spiritual experience. The idea is that if I am assigned female at birth and I am attracted to other people who are either identify as female or assigned female at birth, it is a spiritual connection that I have with them. Right, the sexuality is a spiritual experience. I can attain some sort of spiritual intimacy through my my attraction and my ultimately intimacy with people of the same gender. And the narrative, the conversations around Hasidic youth who are LGBTQ, when kind of presented in positive ways, usually take on these kind of spiritual significance. On the other hand, when they take on the homophobia and the transphobia, also take on a spiritual spiritual nature. So, for example, if the homophobic narrative in that community is perhaps you have a spiritual flaw, right? If you are gay, right, there is a spiritual impurity. There is a spiritual, you are dirty. You are creating some sort of spiritual chasm or problem, or you are not allowing yourself to experience the spirituality the way you were supposed to, because you are gay. Or if it would be a transphobic Hasidic experience, it would be there is again your spiritual journey can only be accomplished if you accept the manhood of your body. And if you don't accept the manhood of your body, and if you try to be a woman or try to identify as a woman, there is a spiritual flaw. There is a spiritual and almost the opposite of holy, whatever we think of as dirty, as impure. It is an impurity, and so that would be the kind of both the negative manifestation of homophobia and transphobia in the Hasidic world, and a positive, let's say, a manifestation would be if a queer person, like I said before, would say, no, I am spiritually the gender I identify, and therefore my spiritual journey, my Hasidic journey, is actually through my my identified gender or my sexuality. So it is a spiritual conflict that has to do with pureness and impureness, and very much connected to the idea that in this community, your spirituality is accessed through these roles in a community. So it is interesting, and I want to, and there are some best practices of dealing with this particular community, and we'll get to that. But I do want to talk about within the halachic or Haredi or non-Hasidic Orthodox Jews. Now, remember that there I said that their connection with Judaism is through law. Their connection through Judaism is ultimately through an understanding, usually it's through a law that's understood via education. So it is this idea of understanding, being able to read law, being able to understand law, being able to follow law, different necessarily than Hasidic Judaism. And the law must have objective criteria to be meaningful. And therefore, the way they I want to do the same thing that I did Hasidic Judaism to this Orthodox Judaism, the presentation. So let's say, I like to start with positive. So a positive presentation, right, perhaps could be that, yes, let's say I am gay, and I am from this Orthodox community and identify with Orthodoxy, and this is the way I see my value through law. So they would then say, okay, perhaps I am gay, and I can accept myself as gay and be fully gay, but I also still have to grapple with the laws about sex. And I would then look at what the Bible and what the rabbinic tradition says about sex, and how it relates to me. So let's say if I am assigned male at birth, or I would be like, okay, well, what does the Bible say about the different sexes, the kind of sex that that a man can have with another man? And perhaps I won't do the things that the Bible prohibits, and I will do the things that the Bible does not prohibit. Right? It's that this is the kind of, because it's a law-based approach to religion and Judaism. Similarly, if I was assigned female at birth and I wanted to have sex with another person who's assigned female at birth, I would look, well, what does the law say about people assigned female at birth? What kind of sex they can have with another person assigned female at birth. And what I mean by what kind of sex, I'm talking very specific. The law is nitty gritty specific, and the law within Judaism is not shy. Right? The law makes very interesting distinctions between things like male anal intercourse, cunnilingus, oral sex, heterosexual anal sex. Like the law covers it all. And it would be a nitty-gritty type of almost medicalized or law schoolized experience of going through these laws and engaging them based on the manifestation of these laws, which and this is kind of and that is the kind of, again, the I would say that is the kind of almost positive presentation of LGBTQ experience, and also when it comes to gender, right? So instead of seeing somebody and seeing themselves within a spiritual context, they would say, well, okay, my body looks like this. What am I allowed to do law-wise with a body that looks like this? What am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? What if I change my body? Does that change a law? What am I allowed to change law-wise? What am I not allowed to change law-wise? Right? Also, very medicalized understanding of religion. And that would be the positive kind of presentation. But let's look at the kind of homophobic and transphobic presentation within this schema, right? So the homophobic understanding is that you are somebody who does not follow the law. Right? Because the law says very, very clearly that a man shall not lie with another man. You lie with another man or want to lie with another man, and therefore you do not follow the law, which is the worst possible thing you can do in this understanding of Orthodox Judaism. And similarly, they will perhaps find laws, and there are some laws that debatable that are against lesbian sex, and they'll find laws that will say that if you were born if you were born with a penis, you are not allowed to wear clothing that is associated with people who are born with a vagina. And I'm being so specific because these laws are so specific. Or there are other laws that say if you are born with a penis, you are allowed to, you are allowed to cut this part of the penis, but not that part of the penis. You are allowed to cut your testicles, but not that much. You are allowed to write. There are all these technical laws, and therefore, if you do not follow the law or brazenly not follow the law, then that would be the ultimate transgression. That would be the ultimate kind of worst thing, sinful person. You would be a sinner. You would be a person who sins, and therefore be treated within whatever the bad value within Orthodoxy or this version of Judaism would be focused on whether you follow or do not follow the law. Within So that would be the law kind of presentation of Orthodoxy. Then the last presentation would be the Sephardi Mizrahi. And remember, there I said that it is rooted in ancestral tradition. So it's not necessarily a spiritual experience, although there's a spiritual component. It's not necessarily written law, because the very idea of something that comes from ancestral is really carried down, right? It's almost like the laws in my family actually may not be the same laws that are in your family, because my family is where I'm getting my traditions for. And it's often very, very rooted in, like many traditions that are rooted in ancestral narratives, there is a huge influence of generational trauma. So a lot of the Sephardi and Mizrahi experience, when they're thinking about their families and their ancestral traditions, they think about the times when their family were either expelled, oppressed, had to hide, had to do something, unbelievable. And what did they sacrifice, and what did they sacrifice for? And those are the things that you must keep now. Because look at what your great-great-grandfather or mother sacrificed their life for. And you must keep that thing, because they sacrificed their life for this, and therefore you owe it to them. So there, the kind of, unfortunately, the homophobic and transphobic narrative can be very clear, right? Your great-great-grandmother sacrificed everything for this understanding of what being a woman or what being a man or what a family is within Judaism. How dare you, because of your own, happiness, you think you're more important than your ancestors who sacrificed their lives for this. They sacrificed their life for this. You can't sacrifice your happiness or your arousal. I mean, come on, right? That's the homophobic narrative there. You are not entitled to your happiness. You are not entitled to your pleasure. You carry the generational trauma of your parents, and that is what you are expected to live up to. Of course, and that obviously can manifest transphobic too, right? The idea is that how dare you change what it means to be a woman in this family? Your grandmother sacrificed everything for this, and now you're just changing everything that your grandmother sacrificed for. Now, on its head, perhaps the positive version can be, I don't know, has anybody seen the movie Encanto? So that resonates very similar to kind of a Sephardic Mizrahi tradition, right? Because and this is the story of Encanto was that the granddaughter says, well, actually, right, the only reason why you perhaps adopted this law was because you experienced such trauma. And maybe you don't, and I can continue the spirit of the law, but perhaps because I'm not experiencing that trauma, I can, you don't have to kind of inherit this trauma to me. So perhaps, like I said, yes, you sacrificed everything for your way of life, and I get that, and I respect that, but perhaps I can actually continue your tradition without necessarily taking that. So that's a very that is a particular kind of dialectic within the Sephardi Mizrahi community about LGBTQ manifestation when it comes to ancestral traditions. So okay, so I just gave you an overview. I want to just do a quick understanding of what I just said, and then I'm going to open up to questions. So I kind of talked to you about who is the Orthodox community. These three communities, these community of Hasidic Judaism, Sephardi Mizrahi Judaism, and Halachic or Judaism. I also talked about the way that both kind of positive identification of LGBTQ identity can seize itself, and also homophobic and transphobic manifestations identify itself. And these are particular, and when you will see patients from these communities, it's important to kind of remember these cultural competencies when dealing both with the teens themselves and also with parents and rabbis communities, because you can kind of say, oh, this homophobia or this transphobia is actually rooted in the way that they kind of understand value in their community. And by understanding the nature of the homophobia or transphobia, it is easier then to validate the values, but then perhaps present an alternative narrative within those values, which is, I think, the goal. It's difficult, but it can be done. We could talk about specifically how that's done, but I also want to, I know I gave a lot of information, and I'm sorry, this is kind of a 101 at this point. You can, you could talk for hours and about this issue. And there is more to talk about, but I want to open up to some questions, and then I want to show you an interesting video that we created in terms of how to present the concept of pride to halachic Orthodox Jews. And that's why it's very specific to halachic Orthodox Jews. But does anyone have any questions or would like me to clarify some things that I was saying, because perhaps I was not as clear as I could be? I'm going to go back to just Santana's question and see how is non-hetero or non-cisgender viewed among the different Jewish communities and the varying beliefs? Well, that is what we were talking about, right? So the non-cis or non-hetero would be considered, would be looked at in the same ways that they see values in and of themselves. So if gender is seen through a law lens, then it would have to be understood through either adapting a law or violating a law. If it was looked at a spiritual essentialist lens, it would be either a threat to spirituality or a new kind of spirituality. And if it was viewed through an ancestral lens, it would either be disrespecting your ancestors or finding a new way to understand and respect your ancestors. And that would be the different ways that gender and sex would be understood, and both heterosexual and non-heterosexual, and both cis and not cis.
I have a question if no one else does, but I want to hold off for a second.
Well, why don't you ask a question, because it always takes a little time for people to brave enough to answer questions.
I was thinking about the last conversation we had about religion and how we talked about connecting with people around values, which is what you just said. I think about values rather than arguing points of theology or anything like that. And I'm just wondering about, when talking to folks who are Orthodox, what might you say to someone who says it's just not part of my religion, or however they might say that, to support LGBTQ youth? Maybe even in maybe let me make it a little bit more practical and say it's a probation officer or a social worker or someone who is like in the community and is like, I can't, we treat all young people the same here. I'm not interested in doing anything special for LGBTQ youth or the such. How would one maybe talk to that person?
Sure. I'll start with the kind of religious, it is a good question, the kind of religious objection. So Let's start with if the religious objection is really viewed under this kind of law framework. You mentioned a probation officer. That's kind of saying, listen, and we've all heard this before. We love the sinner, we hate the sin. And this, and I'm sorry, but I cannot in my social work practice do anything that would promote something that I find unlawful or would promote someone breaking the law.
Right.
So there is an opportunity here, and it's a very similar opportunity. It actually brings us back to how we started this conversation in terms of asking, what do you think of when I tell you, right? When I present Rachel, who is 14 years old and queer, right? What does that mean to you? Or what are you thinking? I'm asking the rabbi or the Orthodox social worker who's told me that there is a conflict. What do you think? What does that mean to you that Rachel is 14 and queer? Right? Does that mean to you that she is sinning? What sin? And how do you know that? Have she told you anything about what she's doing sexually? Has she how do you even know she's sexually active? She's 14. Most 14-year-olds are not, unless you know something that I don't know. Has she? So there's the opportunity here is to say, maybe your thinking, maybe your understanding of what queer is different than what Rachel's understanding of what queer is. Maybe actually there isn't a conflict here. Maybe you have a certain preconceived notions because you're looking through it through this kind of objectified criteria law lens, that you're actually not seeing what an identity of queer means. Because the interesting thing is that the identity queer is not a word that has objective criteria or can fit into a law this way or that way. Right? An identity of queer is far more similar to, let's say, the difference when someone asks you, when someone asks me, Mordechai, what does your name mean versus what is the definition of your name? Right? So perhaps there is an objective definition of Mordechai, but that's not when someone asks me, what does my name mean to me? Right? That is something that's completely subjective. That's outside the rule of law. That's outside the world of criteria. Usually, when Rachel, who's 14, is saying that she is queer, there is a subjective experience going on there, an experience of identity, experience of how I see myself in the world. Right? How I see myself vis-a-vis my friends, how I see myself in terms of how my parents see me, about what my dreams are in the world, what my destiny is in the world, who my community is. Those are the things that a 14-year-old is saying when she's saying she's queer, or even when she's saying, and this is interesting, even when she's saying she's trans or non-binary or gay or lesbian. Right? Yes, I use the word gay a lot, and that's one of my identifiers. But when I use the word gay in public, especially as a professional, I'm not telling any one of you about who I think is attractive, who I think is not attractive, my desires, not at all. Perhaps maybe my one-on-one very close friends who I want to talk about my desires to, maybe that would be what I mean when I say gay. But when I say gay to you now, right, I'm saying that this is a word that resonates to me in terms of how I see myself. How I see myself in society, how I see myself, my narrative, my destiny, who I'm going to love, who I'm going to raise children with, perhaps how I have to fight for my rights, how hard it was to come out to my parents. All of that goes into the word gay for me. So when I would talk to the rabbi, I would say, I don't think that we're using the same meaning of the words, that perhaps you are correct, that in if you are understanding a presentation when somebody comes to you and says, I am someone who objectively disregards law or objectively violates this law because I sleep with this person, I do this thing, I dress this way, then okay, I get it that your whole framework in terms of values are, do you follow the law or do you not follow the law? And then perhaps you don't want to be the reason why someone doesn't follow law. Okay, and perhaps you have a right to that. But I don't think that Rachel, who's 14, when she wants to have some self-worth in terms of her identity, when she wants to feel valued and feel loved by her community, by her parents and by her friends, she's asking to break the law. I think she's asking to be seen the way she sees herself. And that is true about gender and sexuality. That is different than seeing it through the criteria of law. So if we break away and say, you are entitled and to react the way, in terms of breaking law, not breaking the law, to the way you see your value system, but perhaps that is not how this person in front of you is seeing themselves when they say the word queer. So maybe the conflict isn't as much of a conflict as you think. And there we've kind of separated the kind of the world of identity and names from the world of objectifiers and criteria. Very similar to when a queer person is in a hospital, right? And let's say it's a trans person in a hospital. Now, it's very important, I would say, for a doctor to use the name that a trans person calls themselves. And it's not really culturally competent care for if the person is named Rachel, for example, and says, my name is Rachel, and my name is no longer Jacob. No, I don't call myself Jacob. I don't see myself as Jacob. If the doctor uses Jacob because Jacob happens to be on some medical records, I would say that doctor is not really practicing trans competent care. But if Rachel has a penis, right, and therefore, because Rachel has a penis, the care that Rachel, the way that Rachel is going to receive the best care is through the medicine that is appropriate for people who have penises, which very, very often in America is considered under male medicine, right? Then I would say, I don't think that the doctor is not practicing trans competent care by understanding Rachel as medically someone with a penis and categorizing Rachel as someone with a penis. And that's the difference between that is the same difference that we can kind of approach the rabbi with, that understand that perhaps in the world of your medicine, in the world of your criteria, following the law, not following the law, you can see people through that lens, and that's okay. But what we're asking in this conversation is not that. We're asking not for you to kind of see the person of whether they violate a law or not. We're asking you to see a name that they use for themselves, which is not objectively based on objective criteria. Another really good example, and I am going to get to Vanessa's question, is and this is, by the way, interestingly, even within our community, right? So sometimes we're really good as queer people as creating definitions for all of our words. And we love a lot of our queer sensitivity training starts out with definitions. And what does trans mean? What does this mean? We love it. And one of the most popular, most popular used definitions and sensitivity trainings for trans is somebody who identifies as differently from the gender they are assigned at birth. That's a very, very popular definition. If you identify differently from the gender assigned at birth, you are trans. If you identify the same as you were assigned at birth, you are cis. Now, what if someone is gender non-binary or non-binary, right? And so technically they identify differently than the way that they were assigned at birth, but they don't use the word trans as an identifier. Are we to now say, no, I'm sorry, the definition of trans means that you identify differently than you were assigned at birth, so you are trans? And the non-binary person be like, no, I'm not. I am not trans. I don't care what the definition of trans is. I am not trans. I am non-binary, right? So there is so here is where we have this distinction. Are we going to use a definition, objective, law-based thinking in terms of how to identify someone, how to engage in someone? Or are we going to say, well, definitions are important and we can use them, and I'm not going to take away these definitions from you. But right now, the most important thing about someone identifying as non-binary or trans is what it means to you. And asking, what does it mean? And that's true about this Orthodox Rachel, who's 14, who's saying that she's queer. It's less important about whether where it may violate or not violate on your law, in your law book. And much more important, have you just asked Rachel, what does being queer mean to you? Because the likelihood is that she's not thinking in terms of the way that you're thinking, Rabbi, or a religious social worker. I hope that was clear. Vanessa, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and I feel free to go as fast as you would like, because I know we're running short on time. But I did have the question of supporting a youth, and to carry on with your example, Rachel, who's 14, who is defining for themselves what queer means, but saying having a big family is common, like you're saying, in a Hasidic Jewish family. So I'm thinking about that family, and with big families, everybody having different opinions and interpretations of what that means, and how you would support someone like Rachel to have that space to explore what gender means to them, but also helping the family, just helping Rachel, and the family kind of navigate that with a big family.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because especially if, and families, like anybody who's studied kind of family therapy or family psychology, families exist in its own kind of microcosm of psychology and are kind of its own organisms themselves. So it does affect the way we kind of treat one person in the family affects the whole family in its own way. So first of all, I love it that you kind of incorporated something that I said earlier on into kind of a cultural value, the idea that Jews do tend to disagree on things. And that is good. That's a great normalizer in large Jewish families, and to start with, and to understand that, by the way, it's really normal that in a family of 11 people, probably all your brothers and sisters are not going to feel the same way about everything. And that's okay, because there's nothing more Jewish than that. So, right. And that's the reason. So that's a good way of, first of all, just starting, of really kind of validating the idea that people look at things differently. And the other, I think that the best way, and this is similar to the way that I responded to Carolyn, is to be able to, we have an idea of Elu ve'elu, which is a very interesting concept within Orthodox Judaism. The idea that both these and these are the words of God. That perhaps this and its opposite are both the word of God. Fiddler on the Roof has it, like, you're right and you're right. And then someone says, they can't both be right. And then this is, that's also right. It's like, so the idea that we can engage a queer person like Rachel, who is 14, and say that you are entitled to your experience of your own gender. And you are entitled to celebration of that, and a life that is full of kind of navigating where worth and collective self-esteem comes from when it comes to that. However, can you understand that perhaps gender may mean something differently to your siblings? And that doesn't take away from the understanding that you have about your own gender, because really when they're saying that they understand gender differently, they're saying they're understanding their own gender differently, which you want them to be able to have that experience of their own gender. So really to say that, like, it's almost like in when we have when sometimes we do conflict resolution, we really try to really root everything in I statements and say, like, yes, you are entitled to your extremely strong opinion about things because that is true for you. But can you be in a space where something can be true for you and for your sibling can be something very different for them, right? It's using kind of DBT, dialectical behavior therapy skills, and to be like, to say the idea that your sibling sees their gender differently than you see your gender is not a conflict, is actually an opportunity. And it could be hurtful. I understand that it's hurtful that your sibling sees his gender very much rooted in his body, very much rooted in the laws about his body, very much rooted in his ancestral understanding of gender. And that may be hurtful to you because that's not the way that you see the gender in your body. But can we live in a world where that's the way he sees his gender in his body, and you understand, and you can even validate that for him. You understand that that's not the way you see gender in your body. And if we can teach Rachel, and again, it's not just teaching Rachel and teaching Rachel's sibling, that they can see their own gender and their own bodies differently, and that's not necessarily a conflict with each other. That would be the goal, to validate each other. And even when that means validating an understanding of gender that perhaps if it was on me would seem very oppressive, but maybe is not oppressive to my brother.
Mm. Thank you so much. I'm sorry that we have to cut it off because we've reached time, but this has been very, very interesting. Very grateful to you, Mordechai, for being here today, and for everyone for participating. Please look out for more emails. We'll continue to have conversations like these in the future, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Yes. If you can send out the jqy.org, you can find more videos on this, some of the videos that I talked about. So it's jqy.org, jewishqueeryouth.org, jqy.org, and there's many videos about some of the things that I've talked about, and so you can see that on your own. And you can also contact me through that website too if you have any more questions. And these were great. Thank you for all these great questions.
Thank you.
And it's a difficult subject, so I'm glad that you're engaging this with me, and together we're going to make the world better.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye, everyone.